feet. No, you can go 1 meter, which is about 3 feet. So there you go. I'm just telling you what they said. Well, Pastor asked me to do what? Pastor Poppy, I guess he was going to be out of town or something. And so he asked me, I'm going to close. Should we close this? Asked me to talk a little bit about the medieval church. Uh-oh, baby crying. Okay, I'm not used to baby crying in my class. Freshmen, yes. Occasionally a freshman will break down crying. I'm not sure which one is worse or easier to deal with. So he asked me to talk about this. I think he started a little bit. If anybody was here last time, what did he talk about? I think he started talking about like maybe the Veneration of Saints and stuff like that. Did he say anything about that? Mary. Oh, okay. I'll try not to rush. I could have done pictures and stuff, but the way I thought it, I just didn't think it would be worth trying to do today. So the word medieval is not medieval. I know that's the way we pronounce it. It comes from two words in Latin that means Middle Age. Okay, that's all it means, the Middle Ages. The reason why some guy called it the Middle Ages, between what? What does it come between? The middle of what? Do you know? Does anybody know? Somebody in the back know? Why is it called the Middle Ages? Nobody back there knows? You've had the class. It comes between what? Yeah. Well, he probably got the stuff from J.R.R. Tolkien was actually a medieval literature professor. So yes, he got a lot of his ideas from that. So it comes between the Greco-Roman classical period and the Renaissance. So it's actually a pejorative term originally. The Renaissance scholar said, oh, that's just all the stuff in the middle. So in a way, Reformation Protestants, broadly speaking, have tended to treat the medieval church the same way, right? So we look at the bad stuff. Indulgences, right? We hear about that. Lutherans at least know there were indulgences and they were bad. Okay? That's the one thing we learn about that. Okay. I won't talk much about indulgences today, but just pointing that out. The celibacy of priests and religious orders, right? And the religious orders were very significant in the Middle Ages. Religious orders are groups of people who live in monastic communities, like a Benedictine monks, or the Franciscans, or the Dominicans, etc. Okay, we still have religious orders in the Catholic Church today. You'll see them in Lincoln. A lot of Catholics in Lincoln. You'll see the nuns that wear the blue habits. You ever seen any of them around in Lincoln? Yeah, that's their example of a religious order. So they were very significant in the medieval church. There's no doubt about it. And a lot of them developed during that time period. Okay. So we're focusing on the liturgy, though, and that's what, in theory, everyone would have either observed or participated in, right? So he kind of did a flyby of the early church. Is that what you said? So let's talk about this first. You have generally, and this happened gradually over time. It didn't really happen all at once. It's often portrayed in textbooks as this happened this date, 1059, and that was it. You generally had a division between the Eastern and Western churches in what's the Mediterranean world, okay? So Christianity kind of spread throughout what had been the Roman Empire and then to other places, okay? So the east side of that kind of started going its own way in the 11th and 12th century, and its primary language was, anybody know? Greek, yes. Now, on the other side of that, in the East, they also, as different groups converted to Christianity, like Serbians, later Russians, other groups like that, they had their languages developed and they had services in those languages, okay? What's different in the Western church is the language of the church and the language of the liturgy remained what? For centuries. What was the almost exclusive, not completely though. They did have some vernacular hymns and other things, and preaching was in the vernacular sometimes, meaning in the common language. So what was the primary language of worship in the Christian church in the West? Yes, Latin. So, and Latin was the language of the Romans, right? What about them? Well, the Jews spoke, they preserved the Bible in Hebrew. And so Jews that lived in the Middle Ages, and there were basically two types, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic. Ashkenazi, more the European Jews. They preserved Hebrew, and then they also developed their own vernacular language. What's the most famous Jewish vernacular language? Yes, somebody said it, Yiddish, which is kind of like a combination of German and some other stuff anyway. So yeah, there you go. So we're going to focus on the Western Church, because that's the Lutheran Church comes out of the Western Rite, as it's known, R-I-T-E, Rite. Our liturgy that we follow pretty much in our service book is pretty much the same Rite, R-I-T-E, that people were following for thousands of years. Many, or if not most, of the ways pastors dress, the seasons of the church year, when you read this and when you do that, and all those things that are in our liturgy, pretty much all come from the Western Rite. Many of them were developed in the Middle Ages. For instance, having different colors for the church year, right? So white is generally what type of event in the church year? Yeah, some kind of feast, Christmas, Easter, right? A big deal, the really good stuff, right? Red is usually for what? Could be the Holy Spirit, Pentecost, also martyrs, I think. Saints' days can be red, I think. Yes. Green is usually what part of the church year? Yeah, you're right. It's almost every day, because that's a long church period. It's basically the non-festival part of the church year, which is mostly in the summertime and fall. Yes. Those colors. The first person to write that down and say, these are the colors we should be using and thus and such, I'm sure it was being done some before that, was actually a pope, Pope Innocent III. He became pope in 1198. So I was just reading, I'll look this up. The first person to write that down and say, this should be for this should be for that would be for this, was Innocent III. Just to give you an example. So that's something that stuck. Again, I think that was something that was happening before that. He just kind of formalized it, and then people kind of followed him. That's basically what happened. So that's an example. The whole idea of having like an epistle reading and a gospel reading. Now, there had always been readings in the church because it came out of the synagogue, right? The early church came out of the synagogue and they did readings publicly. So there always been that. That's not what I'm saying. Just kind of the method that it's done, the way we still do it primarily in our Western Rite, which is what we use, developed in the Middle Ages. Okay? Yes? What time? Oh, I'll say something about medieval manuscripts. So, okay, yeah, I think that's what you're asking. Yes, is that right? Yes. So, medieval manuscripts are books. Yes, printing, as we think of it, didn't develop until the 15th century, right? You're right. Medieval manuscripts were books, though. The book idea comes from that. They would actually make manuscripts from animal skin and then write on them.
I have an article about it.
You do?
Yeah, it's from the paper. It's when they illustrated the first Bible.
Oh, yes. Let me see that. Oh, nice.
And they filled it with all St. John.
Oh, yeah, this is a Hebrew Bible. That's pretty cool. So it's got an illustration. Yes, Bibles and thank you. I'd like to look at that later. The Bibles and liturgical documents were often illustrated, marked, just like in our liturgical, our service book. How do you know something's an instruction and not something you say in the service book? If you're looking at the LSB and you're going along and something is in what color is in an instruction? Yes, it's a rubric. That's medieval. Okay, the reason why we have rubrics, pretty simple. They wrote that in a different color so you'd know it was an instruction. So it's just something that stuck, see? So we still use that same pattern. Okay? A lot of the church year, now the basics of the church year was established by the 5th century, I would say, or earlier. But a lot of the various saints' lives, a lot of the traditions that surround different times of the church year all developed in the Middle Ages. Okay? The hours of prayer. So we still have some of these services, like matins. When does matins happen? Morning. Matins literally means morning, by the way. Okay? It's pretty simple. I always say education is a grasp of the obvious, because if you know it, it's obvious to you. Yes?
Is that M-O-R-I-N-E, or is it?
Oh, morning, like when you wake up in the morning. Yes. Good point. So yes, matins means morning, like I'm waking up. Matins was the first service. So, and we also have a service still for the evening. What is that service called? Vespers. Guess what that means? It has to do with the star and all that too, the Vesper star. So anyway, my point is, what do those come from? Well, those come straight out of what were called the offices. And the offices, or hours of prayer, were developed in monasteries, because that's what monks did. They prayed a lot. So they had 8 hours of prayer starting at about 5 o'clock in the morning, going till bedtime. So, and those services kind of just stuck. Or they got, people would take part of that and then use it in church or whatever. So that's basically how those developed, these eight hours of prayer. So that's another example of something straight out of the Middle Ages. That's the way what? Yes, and what was Luther? What did Luther do before he was a reformer? Well, basically, yes. Technically, he was a friar. He lived a monastic style life, though. A friar, he was a member of an order called the Augustinian order, which were technically friars, meaning brothers. There's a little technical difference there, but it's not that big a deal. So some other things about the medieval church. Some of you I know have been to Europe, because I went with a few of you with me. If you go and you look at a church that actually existed, like Notre Dame in Paris, probably the most famous one, what are the kind of things you see? What have you seen in a church? This is what it's kind of an idea. How did they decorate their churches? This is what I'm getting at. Were they bare and boring for the most part? Or stained glass. That becomes a big deal in the 12th century. What else? Images. In the Western church, they tended more to have statues. But they do have paintings. So yes. Yes, relics. Oh, thank you for bringing up relics. The relics are important. Yes, way in the back, Vicar. Yes. Because the only way to support the building, that's just an architectural thing. A flying buttress is the support on the outside of the building. Do I show up there? Can you see me up there? Do I look good on TV? Yeah, okay. So, all right. So a flying buttress are those things on the outside. The reason for the flying buttress is to support the wall, the really thin walls. So if you've been pretty much anywhere in Western Europe, you should have seen some form of Gothic church. And Gothic basically starts in the 12th century. But what I wanted to point out was the church was a place that had images, statues, everything had a meaning behind it and pointed towards a greater reality. That was the idea. Now, some people point out that, I think it was actually Gregory the Great that originally said this a long time ago, that images are the Bible of the illiterate. Okay? I've always wondered about this because I've been in a lot of these churches, frankly, and I still don't think the illiterate you have to be pretty literate to actually understand a lot of the images. If you know the Bible pretty well, you can probably figure out. So I've always wondered about that. But even if you didn't understand every image, it is awe-inspiring. If you've ever walked in a massive Gothic cathedral, right? You automatically want to do this. Yeah. Yes, what? The large churches I'm talking about were cathedrals, which means they were the centers of the bishop. Okay, so yes, I think I know what you're getting at, or this is where I'm going to take it anyway. There are quite a number of cathedrals that were built, and it was really bishops trying to outdo each other. Our towns, because if a town grew up pretty large around a cathedral, it was kind of like a competition between different towns to see who could build the biggest church. Pretty cool. One church, I think it's in Amiens, can hold 10,000 people, or could have held 10,000 people when they built it. Another thing about medieval worship, there were no pews. There were no pews. There were no chairs. If you see a movie and they're all sitting down, that's an anachronism. They always show you these movies like Robin Hood or something. They wouldn't have all been sitting down. Now, that didn't mean they didn't maybe bring chairs in there for people who couldn't stand or whatever. But there were no formal pews in church, permanent chairs in a building, like in a church building, really didn't start till the 17th century. Even if you look at all the early paintings of Lutheran worship, nope, not everybody's sitting down in pews. They're not, because they didn't have them. They stood. You stood. And if you go to in the Eastern Church, they've retained this. If you go to Russia or Greece or Romania and to an Orthodox church, you will stand unless you bring your own chair. I don't know if they let you bring it in, but yes. Probably not in some of them. Yeah, you remember I was with them on the trip. I went on one of the trips I've been on, and you notice if you go, these pulpits are way up high. Well, there's a practical reason for that. There's no microphone, so you want to stand up in that pulpit so everybody can hear you. It's also a testimony. And those probably started getting built in like the 13th or 14th century like that, with the pulpits up like that. Because it's also a testimony, that's the most important thing, right? And the preacher could get up there and preach and everybody can hear him up there. Yes? The Lutheran churches pretty much look like the other ones because they pretty much just used the same buildings. Now, when Lutherans did start, after the Reformation, there were churches built that were post-Reformation. They did take out some of if there were some things that would be considered too theologically wrong, they might have removed those things. Things like that. But for the most part, if you go to, say, for instance, Wittenberg. Wittenberg's a perfect example.
On our trip to Germany,
Yep.
they still have St. Mary's Church, and it was the one that was...
That's what I'm going to point out. In Wittenberg, the church actually is St. Mary's Church, the town church. If you look at it's called a portal, where you walk over to go into the building, over the door. And there's still an image of Mary being crowned Queen of Heaven on St. Mary's Church, which is where Luther preached. And so they didn't get up there and chisel that off, interestingly enough. Sometimes stuff was removed by people wrongly, like they just broke in there and took it. But if they were building new churches, they would build specific ways to reflect their theology. The pulpit was one that was always specific, where the pulpit would be up high. Yeah?
And that came over to America. I mean, if you've ever been in St. Paul's in Fort Wayne,
Sure.
you got to climb the stairs inside the
Yep.
temple to get to the pulpit. So
And that was the same way. Again, until microphone, there was a practical reason for it, but it wasn't just practicality. It also had a symbolic reason. Lutherans, for the most part, were not iconoclast, meaning they didn't go in and just tear everything out. If they wanted to remove something, they would do so, not just tear it out and throw it away or whatever. In theory, that's what they were supposed to do. There's no problem with stained glass. Lutherans also produced a lot of their own art. The style was mostly followed by Lucas Cranach, who was a friend of Luther, and others. So there is a distinctive Lutheran art form. That would be something to do. Maybe they'll talk about some of that when they talk about the liturgy. So yeah, with the Reformation, at least with the Lutheran Reformation it was about preserving as much as possible. It was not a radical break. That's an important thing to remember. That's why we still use the Western Rite, by the way. Basically, let's talk about the things they did that we don't do anymore. Okay, go ahead. You have your hand raised? Yes. Yes. Yes, and I will talk for the rest of the time more about maybe the 12th to the 15th century, because that's leading up to the Reformation. Now, one of the characteristics of that time period, if you imagine these large Gothic cathedrals as representative, but even in small parish churches, the liturgy became more elaborate. It became more elaborate, meaning there were things added. So, like the sequence was added mostly in the 12th century. A sequence is a hymn that was off, I forgot where it went usually, but I have to look that up. It was a hymn that was added to the liturgy. Things like the gradual and the tract. Some of those have practical value too. The gradual, the point of the gradual, one of the points of the gradual, it's a verse usually, or a phrase sung, we do it in our liturgy, was because they actually moved from one, they read the epistle on one side, and when the gospel reading, glory, that part, they would actually move, and it's a gradual move. So while that's happening, you had a gradual. And they would come over here and read the gospel, see? There's all kinds of various times, and this varied from place to place. I mean, there wasn't one rule about it, about when the priest or the people would make sign of the cross and things like this. At the invocation of the Trinity is a very common time for people to make the sign of the cross. So as the service begins, obviously, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Absolution, right? Anytime there's an invocation of the Trinity, anybody would or could make the sign of the cross as a part of piety, as a part of religious devotion, right? Also, a priest making the sign of the cross. Again, this becomes more elaborate. The way priests dress becomes more elaborate. Like the chasubles get fancier. The art on the back of them get fancier, these kind of things. All the movements of the priest around the altar become more defined. The way you hold your hands, when you do this, that. All this became a lot more elaborate and defined in the church in the late Middle Ages. Also, you had a number of people writing basically handbooks, we would think, to tell you what to do when and all these things. So if you were going to be a priest or a deacon and serve a clergy, you would have to learn all this stuff over time and generally practice it. That's why you have practicing, right? The liturgy was very much a show in the sense that it was a show with a purpose. And I don't mean show in a negative way. I just mean it was a presentation to you, and it, in some ways, is seen as a reenactment of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. Okay? So the whole liturgical year is, right? So we start with Christ coming, and we end with basically the resurrection and then the ascension and Pentecost, and then we go around and we start again. See, the whole church year kind of reflects that. But also within the practice of the liturgy, all the movements of of the priest during the liturgy generally took on some meaning. Kissing at certain time, bowing. Also, another thing to point out, I won't walk out there and do this, but...
Did they have more than one liturgy?
Oh, that's a great question. She asked, did they have more than one liturgy? Yes and no. Everybody, there's quite a bit of development of different types of orders. I think that would be the word we would use. Up to about the 9th and 10th century. It becomes a little bit more uniform in the 12th and 13th century. However, you do not have a single uniform liturgy really until after the Reformation. It's at the Council of Trent, which is the big Catholic council in the 16th century, which is kind of in many ways the response to the Reformation, where they formalize what's called the Tridentine Mass. Now, a lot of the Tridentine Mass is taken out of medieval church orders, just like, frankly, most of the Lutheran divine services too. But that became more formalized. In the Middle Ages, there was actually variant practices in different places. Now, they were pretty much similar, but there were variant practices. Let me say a little bit about the language too. All right. So, one of the things that was significant was the continued use of Latin in the church, and that was all the ordinary would be in Latin. So think like the Sanctus, 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 Benedictus, all these things would be in Latin. Most of the prayers would be in Latin. Again, it depended on what the purpose of the service was. But by the 12th and 13th century, you do have vernacular preaching. Now, some of that was done publicly by groups, like outside, but in churches, if there were a lot of lay people there, it would not have been uncommon to have preaching in vernacular, like French, whatever French would have been in the 13th century, or Italian, or wherever you were. That was actually not uncommon. Now, most of the service was still in Latin. Okay, so that's one thing that's pretty significant. You also did have vernacular hymns developed, by the late Middle Ages. So hymns in vernacular language. And in fact, you also had vernacular Bibles, believe it or not. They were usually translated from the Latin Bible. I have a Latin New Testament right there. So you do have that in the Middle Ages. Now, the whole service was never that way. But it is significant to realize that. Yes?
I guess I don't know the history of this.
Okay.
Now, French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, those are all...
They're Romance languages, yes.
So what was the time scale in terms of...
Oh, they would have been quite different than Latin by the 13th century, yes. Oh, yes, very different, yes. You have, it would be kind of, have anybody ever studied Chaucer? Geoffrey Chaucer? Canterbury Tales? One in April, blah, 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 yeah. So if you look at some Chaucer, you kind of get it, that's 14th century English. Everybody's heard of Shakespeare, I know. Everybody's heard of Shakespeare, right? Have you ever read Shakespeare or listened to it? That's 16th century, that's 16th, 17th century English. So that kind of gives you a, but yes, it was very different even by the 9th and 10th century.
Okay, so it was a gradual process.
Yeah, they went back to the collapse of the 5th and 6th century, yeah. The church in the liturgy actually preserves Latin. Develop its own pronunciation in many ways. Ecclesiastical Latin often has different pronunciations, but the church, through the liturgy and through education, preserved Latin. Okay, that's the language of the literate. To be literate in the Middle Ages meant you knew Latin. Okay, those are the letters you learned. So, and that was generally not a large group of people, but more than you'd think, in fact. Let's talk about a few particulars. Okay, let's talk about Veneration of Saints and Relics. You brought up relics earlier, that's good. So, what role did Veneration of Saints and relics play in medieval religion? A very big role. Okay? Your average person, we're talking about popular religion, the average person would have had a big connection to various saints. Okay? So, saints were important because saints did what for you? What would be the word? What? Yes. There's another word for it that I'm looking for, though. Intercession. That's important. So I'm going to play devil's advocate, okay? So I'm pretending that I agree with that, okay? Just so you understand. So why is that not idolatry from their point of view? Well, it wasn't, because they're not worshiping these people. They did not worship saints. And Catholics do not worship saints today. That's a misunderstanding of their theology. They venerate saints, just like I could respect or venerate anybody. Right? Venerate means to have great respect for. Right? Technically, we still venerate saints. We don't pray to them. Lutherans, I mean. Well, if we have a saint's day, that's venerating them. That's honoring them. That's all. That's what I mean by, in that case, venerate just means to honor or respect. Right? Like we have St. Matthew or St. whatever. Okay. The difference is, in the Catholic Church, yes, the idea in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is really still, in some ways, an extension of the medieval church. It's not the same thing. In the Middle Ages, respect for, veneration of, and even beyond that, petitioning saints for intercession was a common thing. And generally, yes, by the 13th century, you have a number of people writing these books that are called Saints' Lives. And you've probably seen it. Butler's Saints' Lives, I think, is the most famous modern one that you'll still see in the Catholic bookstore. If you go to the Catholic bookstore, Gloria Dei in town, they have Saints' Lives in there. So on a day-to-day basis, that would be kind of your common piety. Now, who was the most significant saint? Or is the most significant saint? Peter, it would not be the most significant. Somebody else said it. Mary. Yes. Mary, the mother of Christ. There were other Marys. Yes. Mary, the mother of God. Mary, the mother of our Lord. Mary becomes and is the most significant saint because, for a lot of reasons. Well, you can imagine why. She's Jesus' mother. I mean, that's pretty significant, right? In fact, Dr. Luther called Mary in one of his sermons the princess of the whole world. There is no woman that deserves greater praise. And that was well after the Reformation. That wasn't him before okay? Just so you understand. We, as Lutherans, confess in our own confessions that Mary is the woman, the Theotokos is the Greek word, God-bearer. And that's generally translated as Mother of God. So we have no problem with that. The problem comes in where? Yeah, we don't ask Mary to intercede for us. Generally, Mary becomes, from the medieval perspective, this is very important. If you live in a society where you need mediators and go-betweens for everything, okay? We're talking about a hierarchical society, right, with kings, and everybody has a position in the world, kings, dukes, etc. It makes sense that you wouldn't go directly to God. You need an intercessor. And what better intercessor can you get than somebody's mother? The mother of mercy. She will never turn you down. Right? Even when Jesus gets a little mad at you, his mama can talk him into liking you again. See? I'm simplifying it. I'm making a little bit of a joke too, but that's the truth. That's the way it was understood in the Middle Ages. That's why she was the most significant saint. And by the 13th and 14th century, although this was not formalized as a doctrine until much later, most Western Christians accepted the belief of the Assumption of Mary, which is that she was bodily assumed into heaven.
I'm catechized in the former Roman Catholic, and that's exactly what I was explaining to them.
Good. Well, there you go. So, relics. What role do relics then? What is a relic? Who can tell me what a relic is? It literally means something left over. What's the most common thing when people die and we bury them? What's going to be left over a long time later? Bones. So bones were the most common relic, the bones of saints. Okay? In the Middle Ages, relics were very significant. They were traded in, they were stolen, they were made up, right? All kinds of things. So a relic of the bones was very significant. If you had the relics, the bones are another object associated with a saint, people would come there to pray and again ask that saint for intercession. Now, if you think about this, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. What do Christians believe about the resurrection of the dead? We believe not just in the resurrection of Jesus, but we confess in the Apostles' Creed, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. So what do we believe actually is going to happen? Yeah, that our bodies will physically, we were not just going to be angels in heaven with harps and such. Our bodies will physically rise from the dead one day. Well, if that's true, then a piece of a saint, that's the piece of a saint.
Yes, but we just got done saying that we would rise with, or Jesus would come
Mm-hmm.
and he would bring up the living and the dead.
Correct. He will, and that's why they would say, this saint bone is the physical body that will rise from the dead one day, and this person's soul is in heaven right now with God. So it's like there's a line from the bone to heaven. See? That's the idea. Okay. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. I'm explaining what they did. Okay. Yes. She thinks I'm going to bring in some relics. I'm not going to bring in relics, I promise. Some other forms of relics besides bones were pieces of the cross, or pieces of wood that were thought to be pieces of the cross, which were pretty significant. Mary, because Mary, most people did come to the assumption that she was assumed into heaven, there were no bones of Mary. Nobody claimed to have bones of Mary. They did claim to have, and this is still in France today, a famous cathedral in Chartres. It's one of the more famous medieval cathedrals. They have the veil of Mary. They claim, obviously, to have the veil of Mary. And it survived 2 fires, so it must be miraculous. When they had a fire in 1194, the veil of Mary was the only thing left. And it was sitting there unburned. And that's the same one, you go look at it today. It's a really old piece of cloth, I can tell you that. That's all I know about it. So yes, that's another example of a relic. So relics were very important. Let's end with the Mass part, probably about 5 more minutes. Probably should have spent more time on this, but I kind of wanted to give you just a general overview. The biggest difference in the Divine Liturgy that you would see, if you went to a Catholic Mass that was maybe traditional, like followed the Tridentine Mass, in fact, one, it would be in Latin, the Tridentine Mass. You can go see this anytime you want, right here in Lincoln, Nebraska. We have more than one place, I think, that does the Tridentine Mass. They call it today the Extraordinary Rite, I think. But there's actually a seminary near Denton. If you drive down Denton, I've been there a couple times with some classes. They're really nice. They always let us eat dinner with them and stuff. And they do all their stuff in Latin there because they're training priests. That's a seminary that trains priests for serving people that want Latin services. So they do every service they do there is in Latin, and it's a basic for a lot of languages, but not all. Probably I don't know, maybe 50% of our words have a Latin base in English. A lot of that comes from French, though, not directly from Latin. So what's called the sacrifice of the Mass is the biggest difference, right? This is the idea, and it would take place within what's called the canon of the Mass. The area, so you have the beginning of the divine service, the readings and the preaching, and then what comes next? Sacrament of the altar, right? So that's pretty much the same thing you're going to see in any church that follows a Western rite. The difference is with the sacrifice of the Mass, there would be prayers that Luther took out and others, because it basically teaches that the Mass is a reenactment or representation of Christ's sacrifice on the cross, because it's the true body and blood of Christ, right? Okay? And the priest, through this action, true body and blood of Christ represents or reenacts the sacrifice that Christ made on the cross. So the language here is very important. The idea is that, I want to get it right, but we as a Christian community, in the Catholic sense, in the medieval sense, we are representing this to you, and we're showing you God did this, and it's going to pay for our actual sins that we've committed. Okay? It's wrong to say they just believe in, quote, works righteousness. There is an element of that. But here's the problem with the language. The way Lutherans talk, and we believe the way the Bible presents the sacrament, is it's sacramental, which means it's not what we're giving back to God. It's what? It's what God is giving to us, right? That's the big difference there. Now, that God giving to us was there in the medieval church. There's no doubt about it. Okay, you had the readings. They believed that it was the true body and blood of Christ. If you received it, you received the true body and blood of Christ, etc. But the idea that this action is a reenactment or representation of Christ's sacrifice at the Mass in order to make atonement for actual sins. That's the idea that Lutherans got rid of, basically. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah. Hold on. I'm not sure I would say it exactly. It's actually, that's kind of the way we understand what they say. I'll put it that way. I'm trying to be as precise as possible. I don't know if I can say what I said again. I'll try. So for the medieval, by the late Middle Ages, the idea is, here's the priest, ask God to take these offerings, and he represents it to the Father. Okay? Christ's death. None of this could work if it wasn't for Christ's death. So it's not something they're doing outside of Christ's death. Does that make sense? But we would definitely see it as something, as an action that we're doing to appease God. I guess that would be the other way around it. Another way to say it. For the Lutheran position is, no, these are gifts that God has given us, and the pastor is the distributor of the gifts through his call and preaching, and that's the main difference. We do believe in the sacrifices. Lutherans do. But the Lord's Supper is not a sacrifice to appease for actual sins. The Lord's Supper is the gift that God gives us. And when Jesus did the Lord's Supper, he didn't say, he did attach it to a sacrifice, though, didn't he? There is a little bit of truth there. Without the sacrifice on the cross, what's the purpose of the Lord's Supper? I mean, it's just eating some food, right? And we could frankly have better food, better bread and more food. I'm serious. But with the cross, it is God distributing his gift. That's the Lutheran view. The medieval view would be, hold on a second. The medieval view would be, we need to do this in order to atone for actual sins. So you are on the right track. Yes?
They do have several excerpts from the stuff.
Yeah, and if you got this book, I didn't want to just read that, but
Yeah, but it's starting on page 24.
thank you. Yes, if you have this, what I'm talking about, he has excerpts from thanks for pointing that out. I was looking at it. He has excerpts from the prayers of the Tridentine Mass. And you can see the offering language there. It should be right there in that one. So I think the sacrifice of the Mass and the way the worship goes for the medieval worship, we're responding to God's grace, and God needs to be shown again that his Son died for us, and this is it. And from the Lutheran position, it's God's grace is being given to us through. It's down to us instead of up to God. Does that make sense? So I think that's the biggest distinction that's important to make. I would say, and it's the biggest change, a tremendous change in the way theology and worship was done from the medieval period into the Reformation. Another thing about during the Middle Ages is when generally they begin to push the altar against back. And almost every church you'll see until the 1960s, whether it's Lutheran or Catholic, the altar is against the wall. And all the worship goes that way, right? That is a development of the Middle Ages, pretty much. I would say by the 13th century that becomes very common. So it isn't until the 1960s and afterwards that you begin to have churches like ours where the altar is not against the wall. So if you go to an old church, even an old Lutheran church in Nebraska, some of you probably grew up with a church like that. The altar is against the wall, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just telling you when it developed. So all the worship then is toward God. Now, when they did the readings, as I said, you would have the readings looking out just like we do. Okay, so I think one of the positive takeaways is, I don't know, we'll probably be done here in a second, I think it's probably good to stop. One of the positive takeaways is, for me, as a person who studied the Middle Ages, is it's not all bad. Okay? And there's actually, God preserved his word. He preserved worship, even if some of it was wrong. The word of God spread. People were converted to Christianity. A lot of us probably wouldn't be Christians right now if our ancestors at some point hadn't converted at that point. If you're German, for instance, in any way. Also, they understood the Bible really well in many cases, although, again, having problems in some places. So those are the positives. The negatives were, yes, the abuse. One, I could have said more about the clergy and the difference with the laity. That would be a negative, I think, as there was too much of a separation between clergy and laity in the Middle Ages. The clergy were too set apart, I think. Now, I think you can go too far the other way and basically say, well, everybody's a clergy. Well, that's not right either. Okay? We're not all clergy. We're not all called to do the same thing. But on the other side, you can go too far this way and say, the clergy are these spiritual people who live special lives and blah, blah, blah. And only they can do certain things and touch this and everybody else. Okay? So, that's probably a good time to stop. I agree with you. So, I'm done. I hope it wasn't too boring. Oh, there's an offering basket. Where's that? In the back, if you want to give towards, is it food relief for Venezuela? Food relief for Venezuela.